The decision to bring charges against President Trump was mine, but the basis for those charges rests entirely with President Trump and his actions. Our investigation developed proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 election and to prevent the lawful transfer of power. Our investigation also developed powerful evidence that showed that President Trump willfully retained highly classified documents after he left office in January of 2021, storing them at his social club, including in a ballroom and a bathroom. He then repeatedly tried to obstruct justice to conceal his continued retention of those documents. January 6th was an attack on the structure of our democracy in which over 140 heroic law enforcement officers were assaulted. Over 160 individuals later pled guilty to assaulting police that day. Exploiting that violence, President Trump and his associates tried to call members of Congress in furtherance of their criminal scheme, urging them to further delay certification of the 2020 election. It's important to state clearly the amount of evidence we had and the basis for why we proceeded. Why we proceeded as we did is because we had a strong case, as I set forth in the final report.
But the president's statements that he believed the election was rife with fraud, those certainly are statements that are protected by the First Amendment, correct?
Absolutely not if they are made to target a lawful government function and they are made with knowing falsity. No, they're not. That was my point about fraud not being protected by the First Amendment. There is no historical analog for what President Trump did in this case. As we said in the indictment, he was free to say that he thought he won the election. He was even free to say falsely that he won the election. But what he was not free to do was violate federal law and use knowingly false statements about election fraud to target a lawful government function. Mm-hmm. That he was not allowed to do. And that differentiates this case from any past history. No, and in fact, one of the strengths of our case and why we felt we had such strong proof is our witnesses were not going to be political enemies of the president. They were going to be political allies. We had numerous witnesses who would say, I voted for President Trump. I campaigned for President Trump. I wanted him to win. The Speaker of the House in Arizona, the Speaker of the House in Michigan. We had an elector in Pennsylvania who is a former congressman who is going to be an elector for President Trump, who said that what they were trying to do was an attempt to overthrow the government and illegal. Our case was built on, frankly, Republicans who put their allegiance to the country before the party. And so the president got information from people he trusted on other issues. He rejected it whenever it didn't fit him staying in office. And there was a pattern in our case where anytime any information came in that would mean he could no longer be president, he would reject it. And any theory, no matter how far-fetched, no matter how not based in law, that would indicate that he could, he latched onto that. And we were confident that we had very strong proof of that pattern. He also, I would just add, very consciously did not try to reach out to the sort of people who have the most expertise on these issues. He reached out to people who he thought could back him up. Well,
right?
Well, with respect to the Arizona Speaker of the House, that is someone the president reached out to. He also reached out to governors. He reached out to the governor of Arizona. He reached out, and again, Republicans, his allies. Our case was a case in which the president was preying on the party allegiance of people who supported him. And these are, again, the record is rife with examples of him reaching out to those people, inviting them to the White House. And another example, sir, is the folks from Michigan. He invited them to the White House. They told him, you lost because you underperformed with educated females. They told him that when he brought them there. And again, our case was filled with examples of that. The evidence here made clear that President Trump was, by a large measure, the most culpable and most responsible person in this conspiracy. These crimes were committed for his benefit. The attack that happened at the Capitol, as part of this case, does not happen without him. The other co-conspirators were doing this for his benefit. So in terms of why we would pursue a case against him, I entirely disagree with any characterization that our work was in any way meant to hamper him in the presidential election. I would never take orders from a political leader to hamper another person in an election. That's not who I am, and I think people who know me and my experience over 30 years would find that laughable.
So did you develop evidence that President Trump was responsible for the violence at the Capitol on January 6th?
So our view of the evidence was that he caused it and that he exploited it and that it was foreseeable to him.
But you don't have any evidence that he instructed people to crash the Capitol, do you?
As I said, our evidence is that he, in the weeks leading up to January 6th, created a level of distrust. He used that level of distrust to get people to believe fraud claims that weren't true. He made false statements to state legislatures, to his supporters, in all sorts of contexts, and was aware in the days leading up to January 6th that his supporters were angry when he invited them, and then he directed them to the Capitol. Once they were at the Capitol and once the attack on the Capitol happened, he refused to stop it. He instead issued a tweet that, without question in my mind, endangered the life of his own vice president. And when the violence was going on, he had to be pushed repeatedly by his staff members to do anything to quell it. And then even afterwards, he directed co-conspirators to make calls to members of Congress, people who were his political allies, to further delay the proceedings.
When you finished your investigation in the special counsel's office, you believed that you had sufficient evidence in this case to prove Donald Trump committed those crimes after the 2020 election?
I did.
And you believe that you had enough evidence to get a conviction with Donald Trump taking or willfully taking the classified documents after he left office in 2020 and returned to Florida in 2021?
That's correct.
And theoretically, what happens if there is election interference and the people who are responsible for that are not held accountable?
It becomes the new norm, and that becomes how we conduct elections.
And so the toll on our democracy, if you had to describe that, what would that be?
Catastrophic. The right to vote in a presidential election is one of the most sacred rights that Americans have. And in this particular case, we had strong evidence that the defendants in this case sought to interfere with, obstruct, injure that right. We had evidence, in just a couple examples, where President Trump was asking local officials to find 11,000 votes. When you find 11,000 votes, you're diluting other people's votes. We had evidence that they were targeting certain states, and particularly certain parts of certain states, generally urban parts of states, to have those votes thrown out with no factual basis whatsoever. I believe we cited this in our final report, but there's even statements of the co-conspirators in this case, at least one it's coming to mind now, specifically saying we want to get rid of these votes. We want to subtract them. And diluting the vote count in that way, there's strong precedent for that being a violation of the statute that we charged. Well, the lawsuits, we made clear in our indictment that there are proper ways to dispute an election, and asking for an audit, which President Trump did, and I believe in only 2 of the states that were in question, that's a way you can do that. Filing lawsuits, completely legal and proper way to do that. But in this case, those lawsuits were part of our proof that put President Trump and his co-conspirators on notice. The suits, the results, and the things that court said in finding those suits without merit put him, were one component of evidence that put him on notice that these allegations were false. Also, there were instances where there were pretextual lawsuits. There was one lawsuit, for example, that was filed in New Mexico minutes before the deadline, so they could say there was a dispute in New Mexico so they could proceed forward with the fake electors ballot. There was another lawsuit in Georgia where one of the co-conspirators explicitly said in an email, we're on notice that the things in this lawsuit aren't accurate, so we shouldn't have the president sign a certification of this lawsuit. And then they played with the language a little and had him sign a certification nonetheless. And so these lawsuits, well, filing a lawsuit absolutely clearly is something you can do. They were probative evidence of the criminal intent in this case for those limited reasons I just suggested. So I am eyes wide open that this president will seek retribution against me if he can. I know that. About a time, and the timeline of that afternoon was particularly important because that violence started. The president refused to stop it. He endangered the life of his vice president. Then he's getting calls, and not calls from Democrats, not calls from people he doesn't know, calls from people he trusts, calls from people he relies on, and still refuses to come to the aid of the people at the Capitol. That's very important evidence for criminal intent in our case.
Right, but
The fake elector scheme was part of what I was investigating, and it ultimately became part of the charges in the case.
okay.
We had electors who were going to be witnesses. I referenced earlier a congressman from Pennsylvania who had said this was an attempt to overthrow the government. We had other electors who said, I was told that this would only be used if we won in litigation. And obviously the record in our case showed that the co-conspirators were trying to use their elector votes despite that fact. And again, this goes to the point I made earlier. These are people who wanted to be electors for Donald Trump. They are not people who are opposed to him. They were not people who are from a different political party or enemies. And so the fact that we had elector witnesses like that who felt either they'd been misled or they felt that this whole effort was an attempt to overthrow the government, I thought that was pretty powerful evidence. And so we moved that part of the investigation forward with the rest of the case. Electors were told that they would only be used in these circumstances, and as other ways of overturning the election fell away, and as President Trump and his co-conspirators became more desperate, they came up with even more obviously illegal ways to try to stay in power, and it eventually devolved to, let's just say that these are the electors, regardless of whether any court has said so, the governor has said so, the people of the state and most have said so, and they didn't go back to electors and say, hey, we're going to use I know we told you we were only going to use this if we won a lawsuit. They just went ahead and used it. I mean, I think, again, even among the fake electors, there would have been witnesses. I'm thinking of one witness in particular in Georgia who I thought would have been very powerful I would never have done this if I thought they were going to use my name to overturn the will of the people. just because one person said so.
Subsequent to that, in December, there was an effort to create fake electors. And in fact, on December 14th, when the electoral colleges meet in all the state legislatures, there were 16 fake electors in the basement in Michigan, and 4 of them tried to get into the Capitol to overturn the election. Did you look at that whole phenomena?
We did. What they were doing and what the email traffic among co-conspirators showed is they were trying to mimic the procedures that are required by the Electoral Count Act, but they couldn't mimic them. And if I recall, the email traffic on this started with, we have to follow these procedures. And then when it became clear they couldn't follow all the procedures, it was like, well, do the best you can, follow as many as you can. And so I think, if I do recall, certain states, it may have been Michigan, that the electors had to convene in a certain government location. And so as a result, I believe there may have been a state official involved in trying to get them into, if I'm thinking of the right situation, get them in there so again they could mimic the procedures, even though they were not the electors that represented the will of the people, how the vote was actually counted.
Thank you.
I will just say, though, that one of the things we were investigating was things that happened in Fulton County. Particularly, there was an election worker by the name of Ruby Freeman, her mother, and she was the mother of a woman named Shay Moss. They were people that Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump targeted with absolutely false claims of election fraud, claims that Rudy Giuliani later admitted he didn't have evidence for, claims that he was held liable in defamation for, caused them to endure all these sort of vile threats. And that whole episode, as well as sort of the claims, the false claims about the vote count in Fulton County, we did look into that and collect evidence.
And what was the nature, let's start with before January 6th. What was the nature of some of these communications with the White House or with co-conspirators of Donald Trump leading up to January 6th and members of Congress?
Well, it varied. Sometimes the communications were relevant to us to show that people were telling Donald Trump that the things he was saying were not true. Other times they were evidence of the false nature of the things that we're saying. So for an example would be, there are 2 voicemails that Rudy Giuliani left for senators, and those voicemails show him saying things that were not true, using knowingly false claims to try to get those senators to further delay the certification of the vote. We had evidence from Department of Justice officials that Donald Trump said to them, just say the election is corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. I think given that was the perspective that Donald Trump had, our view is that the case we would have presented at trial would have been Donald Trump preying on the party allegiance of people in his party. And people like the vice president didn't agree to that. People like the elector from Pennsylvania I mentioned didn't agree to that. People like the Speaker of the House in Arizona didn't agree to that. But the extent to which those contacts were happening was relevant to our investigation. We also, in the course of the investigation, interviewed Rudy Giuliani. And one of the things that we asked him, if you recall, in the message, I can't remember which senator it was for, but in the message that he left, he said, referenced the fact that he was calling on fellow Republicans. And in the interview, we asked him, why did you say you were calling on your fellow Republicans? And he said, well, I wasn't going to be calling Democrats about this. Even some Republicans wouldn't go along with this. And so, of course, I would call only Republicans. And in fact, that was consistent with our investigation throughout that the people that President Trump and his co-conspirators reached out to were people who they thought would go along or help them because of party allegiance. And Giuliani in particular would reference that he expected their cooperation because they were Republicans. There was one particular meeting that he attended where he got a hostile reception because he had no evidence to back up the fraud claims. And he said something to the effect of, "I thought we were all Republicans here." And so that was a theme throughout the case. And it went to the strength of the case that we had because the witnesses we were going to call were the people that the president reached out to sort of further this criminal scheme.
Why? So did you recall any evidence when you were talking to Mr. Giuliani that he truly believed all the voter fraud claims that he was putting out around the country?
Our evidence was he did not. And in fact, when we interviewed him, he disavowed a number of the claims. He claimed they were mistakes or hyperbole. Even the claim about Ruby Freeman, where he, basically destroyed this poor woman's life by claiming she was a vote scammer. President Trump did the same thing in a recorded call with the Secretary of State. He disavowed things he'd said in that interview. To that question.
Mr. Bannon made an extraordinary video basically predicting the events of January 6th on the day before. Were you able to discover, either by interviewing Mr. Bannon or those who had knowledge of what he was doing, how he was aware of the riot before it happened?
We did not interview Mr. Bannon. I believe that particular statement you're talking about would have been part of our proof, and my recollection is that we had evidence that would indicate from some point, not immediately after the election, but shortly thereafter, sometime, might have been closer to December period, that Bannon, who had been out of touch with President Trump for some period of time, got back in more regular touch with him at some time. There was an exchange between those two where I believe it was Epstein asked Bannon, "Are you in touch with him?" And the answer was affirmative, and it was something to the effect of, "He's still on fire." And that's right at the same time that these calls are happening, after he refused to do what he could to stop the attack on the Capitol, after the tweet about Mike Pence.
In your report, you say, and this is a quote, "The through line of all of Mr. Trump's criminal efforts was deceit, knowingly false claims of fraud." Can you generally describe some of these knowingly false claims of fraud that were spread after the 2020 election?
Sure, there's a number of them. And part of the explanation is why they're false. And so, just off the top of my head, an example is he was on notice in this election that in Pennsylvania, for example, that he would be ahead in the vote count for a period of time, and then when the mail-in ballots were counted, his lead would dissipate. He chose to represent that phenomena that he'd been briefed on, that was normal course of an election, that all sides knew that that's how it was going to be. He chose to present that as evidence of fraud. And to people who were not maybe as informed as him, or informed as his campaign managers who told him these things, that's the sort of thing that creates distrust. There were fraud claims in Michigan, Georgia, where he was specifically disabused by people he trusted, by political allies, by the people, when he chose to call them, who were best situated to know. In Georgia, I'm thinking of the Secretary of State. He reflexively rejected those things and continued to state false things after he'd been told that repeatedly that they weren't true. It was pretty damning evidence that he knew these things were false. He only brought fraud claims that involved states that he'd lost. He only approached people generally who had party allegiance to him. When he was told that a fraud claim wasn't true, he didn't stop making it. He was repeatedly told by people that the very fraud claims that would change the outcome were not true. There was another staffer who overheard him saying, something to the effect of, and I want to make sure I'm not inaccurate here, it's in our final report, but basically, like, you keep fighting regardless of whether you won or lost, things of that. Sure. These would be false claims about dead voters. It would be false claims about underage voters. It would be false claims about illegal alien voters. The false claims were generally, as a general matter, about urban centers where he had lost the vote in a particular state that was otherwise close by a lot. Yes, and again, these were claims that were rebutted by people around him who knew that they were false, and in many cases told them they were false.
President Biden?
Yeah, so this paragraph references different statements that he made in the presence of other people. One is that it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still fight like hell. And then the other was, can you believe I lost to this effing guy?
So,
Referring to Joe Biden. The cherry on top, if you will, the evidence that I felt was most powerful was the evidence that came from people in his own party who, as I said earlier, put country before party and were willing to tell the truth to him, even though it could mean trouble for them.
Vice President Pence, what did Donald Trump want Vice President Pence to do to overturn the election results?
Well, ultimately, he wanted him to just hand him the election to say he won. There were different proposals that President Trump and his co-conspirators put to Mike Pence, but in essence, he wanted Mike Pence to impose his own choice about who should be president over the will of the American people who voted in the election.
Was one of those ways that Donald Trump tried to pressure Mr. Pence was to reject the lawful electors' certificates of their votes during the electoral counting process? Was that one of the ways that you recall?
That's correct.
How did Mr. Pence respond back to Mr. Trump's pressure about rejecting the lawful elector certificates?
I think Mike Pence, Vice President Mike Pence, falls into the category that I described before. He did something that was very hard to do. He went against his party. He paid a price for it. But I think, again, someone like that putting country over party, I think he would have been an effective witness. He did not agree to go along with it.
You just talked about with Mr. Pence's response to President Trump's pressure. Is this yet another example of evidence that showed Mr. Trump knew or should have known that what he was saying to the American public was false regarding the election of 2020?
Yes, the vice president was one, and this is alleged in our indictment and our filings, was one of several people saying he was not seeing the outcome determinative fraud that Donald Trump was claiming.
And what would have happened if Vice President Pence would have gone along and refused to count the lawful elector certificates?
Well, thankfully, we don't know, but I would say that he and the other people who stood up and said, I'm not going to do that, may have changed the course of history in terms of our country, of having an election where someone took power in our country who didn't actually win the election. So, as I said, I think it took a lot of courage on his part. He's also someone who, as you all know, when the attack on the Capitol happened, he wouldn't leave. People wanted him to leave. And I think, again, that reflects very well on him. I think, and this isn't just me, the Court of Appeals in this case, when we litigated it, said that if the things we alleged were proven, it would amount to attack on the structure of our democracy. Those aren't my words, those are the court's words. And so whether a case is of that import or of less, I think you go about it the same way, but obviously the consequences for our country are quite different.
Have you made any statements, or are you willing to make any statements on the firing and removal of the Department of Justice prosecutors who worked on January 6th, on people at the FBI who were involved in the FBI investigation, or on the president's mass summary pardon of 1,600 January 6th insurrectionists and other people involved?
Yeah. I think what has happened to career prosecutors and career FBI agents is awful. It's contrary to the rule of law. It's contrary to who I think we are as a country. One of the agents on our case, he served his country overseas multiple times, war zones. Family of dedicated public servants, wife's family, dedicated public servants. He got fired for doing his job 2 weeks after his wife died. I went to the funeral. I saw his family. I saw a church full of public servants. No reason a person like that should have to go through that. And I'm getting emotional. I'm sorry about that, but I just think that's wrong.
Set up, in terms of administering elections. And the Supreme Court changed that and said that, signature verification wasn't required. The volume of absentee ballots was completely different than an ordinary election. There were over 2 million, absentee ballots. And so, we just wanted to point out, and I guess ask you the question, were you aware of all these irregularities and disparities because of the COVID and so forth? So many things had changed by the time it got to Election Day in Pennsylvania.
Well, what I can say is that some of the issues you raised are the sort of issues that a campaign or someone who's a candidate can raise in the courts, and I believe a lot of these issues were raised in the courts. I think Donald Trump lost those litigations, and as we pointed out in our indictment, that bringing a lawsuit for some of the issues you talked about, that's the proper way to dispute these things, or asking for a recount, as President Trump did in 2 states. Our case was about false allegations of fraud. Our case, we did the things you just mentioned. We didn't allege those to be part of the fraudulent conduct targeting a government function. And so, again, those are issues that I think we were aware of in studying these things and in speaking to election officials there. But they're the sort of issues that are dealt with through litigation in our court system, and I think that's what happened in the election after.
Okay.
Do you feel like you have a target on your back?
I believe that President Trump wants to seek retribution against me because of my role as special counsel.
Your report talks about the rioters, the crowd that violently attacked the law enforcement officers attempting to secure the building on page 25 of your report. One of those rioters was Daniel Rodriguez, who multiple times plunged a stun gun into the neck of Officer Michael Fanone, causing Officer Fanone to suffer a heart attack and sustain other injuries. Mr. Rodriguez was subsequently sentenced to 12 years in prison after a federal judge called him a, quote, one-man army of hate. Are you aware of President Trump pardoning Mr. Daniel Rodriguez?
Not him specifically, but my understanding is he pardoned all the people who violently assaulted police officers that day.
So in pardoning all the people who assaulted police officers that day, another example is a Mr. Patrick McCaughey III, who used a stolen police riot shield to crush Officer Daniel Hodges in a metal door frame at the entrance of the Lower West Terrace Tunnel, and he left Officer Hodges trapped, bleeding, even crying for help from his fellow officers. Officer Hodges testified, and this is a quote, if I was there much longer being assaulted in such a way, I knew that there was very likely I wouldn't be able to maintain my consciousness. Judge Trevor McFadden described Mr. McCaughey as a, quote, poster child of all that was dangerous and appalling about January 6th. Stating that his actions were, quote, some of the most egregious crimes ever committed that day, end quote. Mr. McCaughey was sentenced to more than 7 years in prison. Are you aware that Mr. McCaughey was one of those rioters who assaulted law enforcement on January 6th that were pardoned by President Donald Trump?
Again, I don't know his specific name, but I know people like him who did things like he did were pardoned.
And are you aware of the more than 140 police officers who were injured by the pro-Trump mob on January 6th, sustaining injuries such as cracked ribs, traumatic brain injuries, smashed spinal discs, In heart attacks as rioters used bats, flagpoles, chemical sprays, stolen police shields, and batons to beat officers. Are you aware of those facts from that day?
Very much so.
Do you believe that pardoning individuals like this who committed crimes against law enforcement that day makes our country safer?
It does not, in my view.
Can you explain why, from your prosecutorial experience, prosecuting gangs, prosecuting violent crimes, why pardoning individuals who committed violence on January 6th doesn't make our country safer?
Well, I don't think it's really my opinion. I think we've already seen some of the people who were pardoned go on to commit other serious crimes, and I don't have much doubt that in the coming months and years, we'll see more of that. People who would otherwise be incarcerated, communities protected from them, they're out in communities, and my view is that we will continue, unfortunately, to see people who were pardoned for committing violence on January 6th continuing to commit additional crimes. That's my view.
I guess taking a step back and looking at the fact that President Trump pardoned these folks, these 77 individuals who were previously working to overturn the election, the 2020 election, what message does that send to folks living in the country, particularly as it relates to election integrity in future elections?
I just, I don't understand why you would pardon people who assaulted law enforcement. I think it sends lots of messages. One of the messages is to law enforcement, the people who defended the Capitol that day, in my view, are heroes. And I think pardoning people who assaulted them is wrong.
And what about pardoning the folks who actually worked on the conspiracy to overturn the election? What message does that send about election integrity to folks living in the country?
Well, I don't have a full list of all the people that he pardoned there, and so I don't want to speak generally about all those cases. We didn't charge anybody other than Donald Trump, and so I'm not going to speak about pardoning people who weren't charged with crimes.